Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
The President delivers his State of the Union address this week while the state of Virginia is in political turmoil. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. President Donald Trump gave his State of the Union address this week to a very different audience than in the past. This time, as he looked out at the chamber, he saw a sea of white from the many Democratic women who have been elected as part of a new Democratic majority in the House. And there was House Speaker Nancy Pelosi looking over his shoulder and perusing his speech. Then there was the state of Virginia. Governor Ralph Northam and Attorney General Mark Herring, both Democrats, are wrapped up in scandals involving blackface incidents. And the Democratic Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax, is facing an accusation of sexual assault. If all resign, the governorship could actually wind up in the hands of Republican House Speaker Kirk Cox. Take a look at this week's events. In studio, we have John Barkovich, a Wicomico County Republican, Barry Tillman, former mayor of Salisbury, and Salisbury University political science professor, Michael Laughlin. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, John, I want to start with you. So, what was your assessment of the speech? What was he trying to do? Was it effective?
Oh, yes. It's very exciting. And because nobody really knew what to expect, because there was all this altercation leading up to the State of the Union and the delay, etc. And from my point of view, he got there and performed magnificently, and I saw the beginning of his 2020 campaign. I thought he dealt with multiple issues in a common sense fashion that was, at least the polls I've seen, even the CBS poll the night of the State of the Union, there was 75%, I believe, of the respondents said that he had done an excellent job with the State of the Union. So I think it was well received, and it was an opportunity for him to get his message to the people without any disruption, swaying, etc. He was able to get right to the American people and discuss the issues that are bothering he and our administration, and those include not only foreign policy with, ISIS and North Korea, but they include the southern border. It includes the economic improvements that he believes he's responsible for, and I agree. And even the women in white had to stand up and applaud when he mentioned the response that his program has brought in terms of women being hired. So I thought it was excellent speech. It was the beginning of the 2020 campaign. And since that time, there's only been more fuel added to the fire. Not only do we have abortion issues that have been brought up, not only do we have the issues of the Virginia leadership, but now we have the Green Dream, and there's plenty of ammunition there. And I think Republicans are excited about the future.
Well, let me just follow up, because some of the critiques is that he was not necessarily looking beyond his base. What about that? What about that critique, that he was really...
He's got his base has always been his focus, and as being a member of the base, I'm very happy with what I saw. Now there are people that are in that tweener stage that aren't part of the base. Will they be swayed by what he said? I hope they at least listen to the speech, and the points that he made, I hope, got through to the public at large beyond the base. But he did not hurt the base one bit with anything he did at the State of the Union. If anything, he solidified the base. Whether or not he's going to add enough other people on top of the base remains to be seen.
Barry, what was your assessment?
Well, I will give the devil his due in that someone wrote a very, I think, decent speech for him to give. The first 15 minutes and the last 10 minutes, were lofty ideals and a good deal of alliteration that sticks with you. But in the middle, it was I've done, and the fact-checking doesn't always agree with the statements made. And the irony is that, we can have civility. What was it he said? We can have... revenge and recrimination and all of that, or we can have, what was it, growth or gridlock? Growth or gridlock was one of them. And he said, I choose growth, and I'm here tonight to work with you. And then the next day, he's calling Adam Schiff, the chairman of the, is it the Intelligence Committee in the House? He's calling him a political hack, and they're all after him, and they never did that to the Democrats, and, which I think we'd like to get Trey Gowdy up here from back in South Carolina, where he is, to talk about months and months of Benghazi, or we could, I'm sure that someone from the 90s would remember Ken Starr and 6 years and no indictments. So, I mean, these things happen, and, the president just, the fact is, it was a good speech at points, but a lot of it was back-patting and talking about the wall. And it just, the fact is Donald Trump was giving it. And so, unfortunately, if past his prologue, then I just don't necessarily believe everything that was being said. And certainly not that he was there to work with people.
Well, I was going to ask, and I'll ask you the same question I asked John, which was, do you think there was anything there outside of the base that he was appealing to? I mean, he's certainly trying to indicate, as you had a moment ago, I think the exact quote is, we must reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution,
Yes.
embrace cooperation, compromise, and the common good. Getting beyond that, did you see anything that was appealing beyond the base?
Not really. I mean, the idea that everybody could work together, that it wasn't two parties, it was one nation. That's appealing, but I just don't see, that's talk, and I've never seen him walk that talk. And so I think it was geared at the base, and it was especially geared to Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, Ann Coulter, and Rush Limbaugh. I mean, those are that's the base of the base, and I think that, he was definitely geared to the base, and there's a certain amount of the base where, as he said during the campaign, Donald Trump said during the campaign, if I murder someone on Fifth Avenue, they're going to vote for me. And I think there's a certain amount of that, but I think that increasingly people are just saying, enough. If you go back to the McCarthy era, and I'm not necessarily trying to compare him to McCarthy, but I think a certain amount of, hyperbole and frantic rhetoric characterized that period as well as this period. And one of the biggest undoings ultimately of Joseph McCarthy was just that people just got tired of it. It was like, enough. So I think it was geared to the base. I don't think that it probably energized many people. You just saw a lot of people sitting there. I felt like the Speaker of the House needed a little something, because she must have chewed her jaw a lot during that. And
Well, let me turn to Michael Laughlin here, because one of the things that struck me is, and I mentioned a moment ago, that he is now making a speech not to the kind of Congress that he had before, but to a divided Congress. Nancy Pelosi very visible over his shoulder. Just got off the confrontation with the government shutdown. Saw the sea of white women. They were Democratic women. What do you make of his speech in terms of where he is politically now that he's got this divided Congress?
Well, there's no question that he now faces an accountability branch that was absent previously. And so, the speech then becomes, I thought this was extraordinary. I would describe the speech fundamentally as a speech of xenophobic nationalism, because of the emphasis on the crisis of the border and this heightening of that we're being threatened by these people coming from the South, and an authoritarian speech. Because what he did was, in the light of this new reality that he's facing, he said he was he revealed his transactional attitude in an authoritarian fashion, where he said, if you threaten me with investigations, you'll get no legislation, right? I'll deal with you if you hold back on investigations, we can get something done. But if you investigate me, I'm lowering the hammer. And that's one of the first times we've ever seen, I think, in my lifetime certainly, a president use the State of the Union speech, which is supposed to be a speech of comedy, a speech of bringing people together, and in spite of some of the rhetoric that happened at the end, this was a laying down the gauntlet speech, and quite again contrary, I think, to respect for the Congress as an equal branch of the government, and clearly Trump does not look at it that way at all.
Sean, what did you make of the fact that he included this? It was a passing reference, but nonetheless, about the investigations. We do have, for instance, the example of Richard Nixon did mention it in one of his State of the Unions, but he only said that in the year of Watergate was enough. He didn't go beyond that and threaten Congress and so on. Well, what do you think that was effective to put it in?
I think it's effective only in terms of this concept that the Democrats have pushed from the very beginning, before he was elected, of collusion and the Russian involvement in the election. And the only reason Hillary lost is because Trump and the Russians worked together, and it's terrible, terrible. And of course, we've had 2 years, millions of dollars, and nothing has been shown to be proved thus far that collusion took place. And within that context, people are beginning to say, we're tired of this constant spending my tax dollars to investigate something that's so far been unproven. So that there's that concept. So if the Democrats in the House are gonna, for the next 2 years, have constant, after Trump, after Trump's people, after Trump's history, after Trump's business dealings, I think it's the American people are going to be tired of that, particularly if nothing gets done. And that's the fallback position that he's bringing forward. If they're going to be constantly after me, how are we going to get anything done? And the wall, has been a very controversial subject, but it looks like we're finally going to get something done this weekend when Democrats and Republicans get together and make a proposal that I believe Trump will accept. And that'll be the first sign that maybe something can be done between Republicans and Democrats and Trump to accomplish something valuable for this country. Now, having said that, there's no guarantee that's going to happen. The other issue that you brought up about Trump's taking a victory lap is I think he has a reason to take a victory lap. That's why the women in white got up and clapped standing applause when he mentioned how many more women are in the workforce as a result of what he believes his policies. And I agree, his policies have made our economy stronger.
To be fair here, I don't think they were actually applauding the unemployment figures. I think they were applauding the fact that this was a 100-year anniversary of the fact that women got the right to vote, and this is the largest proportion.
That was what got them
so
up, and that's
that,
why he said,
that's
don't sit
that,
down.
that's right. That's
That's
right.
what got him up,
So,
and that's why he said, don't sit down.
Yeah.
The interesting thing was that many times the women in white were sitting in there trying to look at each other. Am I supposed to get up for this one or not? And it was clear.
I don't know, but
if you
AOC
watched AOC, she was constantly, should we get up or not? I don't know, But in any case, it doesn't dissuade me from saying that some of what he said, in terms of what I've accomplished, is legitimate and real. And people are working, people are getting paid more, and that's valuable.
Well, I think getting to the women issue, it was clear to me that when the women stood up when he said that this was the largest class of women ever elected, I think they were saying, thank you for giving us your job. We were elected because people were so offended by what you do to women and how you treat women. And I think that was like there was a little tongue in cheek, I think, when they stood up on that one.
That was the nasty.
Yes,
Pelosi
that right
clap.
back at you. Yes,
Right,
yeah,
right, so-
yeah. And I think you can make the point that women are working, but women are working sometimes 2 jobs. They're not making what they ought to be making. So the mere fact that there are women in the workforce doesn't necessarily mean that women are advancing. And to some extent, anyone is advancing just because there are more people in the workforce. And it's difficult. I think that every president, and listen, I'm a former elected official. I understand. You take credit for good times if they're happening on your watch. But it's hard to put a wall down, so to speak, and say everything that happened before was on his watch and everything happened. This is on my watch, because we live in a continuum, and I think that if you look at the whole spectrum, I've created more jobs than any other living human on the planet. I've done this.
I think a more plausible explanation for we're undergoing. We have an economic expansion that was started when, in the Obama era, And you can track that coming in when the Obama people put in place a deficit plan and fusion of funds moving into the American economy, and we're still benefiting from the Obama administration's policies. There's little indication at all that what's happening today is a consequence of anything the Trump administration has done. Even the tax cuts. There's little indication that policy has had the kind of benefits that the Republicans have argued they would.
Well, let me ask you this: in terms, on the one hand, we have very low unemployment rates, right? Which is something that he talks a great deal about. Even low unemployment rates in terms of minorities, although comparisons do shift back and forth, by the way, on that. And yet, despite this great economy, his poll numbers tend to be terrible. I mean, I was looking at a Politico Morning Consult poll that says 52% of people said that they were definitely going to vote for someone else, and some polls I've seen it is higher. So one of the questions I have for you, Mike, first is, how do we evaluate this thing on the one hand in which there's these great economic numbers, which should push somebody into a second term, and yet we have these polling numbers that don't add up, that don't make it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yes, historically, because if you, an incumbent president, if they can get a good economic system going, and if they can have the numbers that support that, then that's really tough to overcome in terms of the upcoming election. I mean, Ronald Reagan, for example. His advisors in the economic slump of 82, I believe, 83, his advisors were saying, you better pack your bags because there's no way in hell you're going to win another term. And lo and behold, though, the military spending, the deficit spending that occurred, zoomed up the economy, and Reagan won an enormous victory. But the predictions for Trump, and I think the reason why you have we'll probably have 100 Democrats running for president, right? At the end of this,
Maybe more. There's a couple that are still undeclared.
Yes, that's right. The reason for that is they see just this golden opportunity because this guy, even with a strong economy, is in the dumps. And I think part of that is a reflection of his racism, his misogyny, and his just clear disrespect for the rule of law, his disrespect, which was evident in the State of the Union speech, for just the decorum of our politics. That, I think, has rubbed American citizens, broadly speaking, except for the base, broadly speaking, against him. And so and I think that accounts for why his numbers are low and will remain so. I don't think the State of the Union will have expanded his poll numbers significantly at all.
John, I want to give you an opportunity because there is this contradiction. On the one hand, there's this economy that's going well. We can talk about pockets of problems, but overall, right?
Overall, it's better, and overall,
right. And yet,
it's really started. It really started 2 years ago. Right. I mean, the unemployment rate, the Dow Jones. I'll go on and on. But that's okay.
Right.
I'll accept.
The unemployment rate was about like at 10 or something when Obama rolled in, right? But what about this? On the one hand, he should be doing much better in terms of polling because of the economic news that he's getting. I mean, how do we square that circle?
That's because where do we hear about the economic news? Did we hear that from ABC? No. Did we hear that from NBC? I don't remember hearing that from NBC. The point is that the only time we've heard about the economic improvement has been when Trump himself has spoken to the American people, be that at his own campaign rallies or other. Media Matters analyses have shown the media 90% of the time it's anti-Trump.
Excuse me, John. In the Washington Post, which I read religiously.
I do too.
Right? Then those numbers come through that all the time. They report that quarterly.
The point I'm going to make, though, is that in spite of that, the base has stayed with him, and his number has stayed almost without change at 44 to 45.
But it seems to me it should be higher. And let me make a suggestion to you. Which is what I think I'm seeing in part is that despite the good economic numbers, which are reported, that the news gets dominated by all the other things that he does, and that he's almost stepping on his own message. In other words, like when he got up and he talked about how
If you're going to ask me to defend his tweets, you're not going to get me to do it. Okay.
I mean, well, I'm just saying.
That's if you're going to ask me to defend his tweets, I
but
won't.
doesn't that hurt him?
I understand. I
That
understand
economic
that
news.
his personality, okay, has had a detrimental effect in terms of his acceptance by many. Okay, I'm not going to argue that. The base accepts all that because they elected him knowing all that. He was elected 2 years ago in spite of those personality issues. And they have seen nothing except what he said he was going to do as far as they're concerned. He has attempted to do it. He has attempted to control the border. He has attempted to reduce taxes. He's attempted to reduce regulation. He's said, I'm going to get the economy going. I'm going to reduce unemployment. And he's done all those things. So the base, they don't accept that he's doing something wrong. Now,
But what about everybody else?
No, but what about the other 60%?
Yeah, right.
Well, I don't know that they're going to make that decision to support him until they know who he's going to be running against. Because I think the midterms, many of the Democrats that got elected did that on an anti-Trump status. There's no question about that. But they also ran on health care. They also ran on other issues of which they've done nothing yet to accomplish. So I think we'll see what happens in the next years, but if the next 2 years is spent entirely on investigating Trump's business practices in his hotels around the world, then they're not going to get anything done, and then the voters will be making a decision in 2 years, and they may come back to Trump just like they did 2 years ago. And one other thing,
Yeah,
the Green
okay.
Dream doesn't hurt him either.
Well, and we can actually talk
get to
about
that.
that a little
Virginia
later.
doesn't hurt him either.
Yeah, and we will get to Virginia. But
Okay.
So what? And one of the things that John's alluding to is how the Democrats handle the future going ahead, because there's a balance between investigations and then proposals that they want. In that mix, particularly for the House, is House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. This is a person, by the way, who has been, certainly the last time around, was an extremely effective speaker. I mean, she got the health care bill done. I mean, she delivered when asked to do so.
With a big majority.
With a big majority, but nonetheless, she got her caucus to get through, particularly. And there was a lot of debate, by the way, on the health care thing.
Yeah.
So how do you see her handling this tension that exists between, on the one hand, there are investigations, but on the other hand, trying to at least pass legislation, which she then knows that a lot of that will not then get through the Senate. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you see her, particularly as a former political figure yourself?
Well, I think that it's important that she that she keep the caucus together, which she did very effectively during the shutdown. And I think that the Republicans had hoped, gambled, thought that the Democrats in the House would peel away when the going got tough, and they didn't. They stayed on point and on message. I think that she's going to balance it so that there are appropriate investigation going along, because I mean, what we had in the House Intelligence Committee wasn't. I mean, it could be it'd be Broadway show, the Devin Nunes Follies. I mean, it was pathetic. It was I would say bordering on illegal. I mean, the things that were going on with him at the helm. So I think that there needs to be a balance of that, but there has to be some kind of putting things forward, putting concrete programs forward, infrastructure, things like that. And I think that, the environment can play a lot on it. I mean, President Trump doesn't believe in global warming, but the government agencies that are tasked with that have proven that things are not good and getting worse a lot quicker than many people thought. But I think that if the past is any indicator, she's going to be able to hold that caucus together and to keep them at a balance of their oversight responsibility. As Professor O'Loughlin says in his class that I took last semester in public policy, that
How'd she do?
She did wonderfully.
that the Article 1 is the legislative branch. So that was the first thing they thought of, the Founding Fathers. They intended for that to be the major body. And then Article 2 was the executive. And we've kind of gotten that turned around. And certainly in President Trump's mind, it's turned around. And I think that the idea of putting war on a par with investigations is really throwing the gauntlet down and saying, you'll get nothing out of me. He said that right after the midterms. that if they were going to spend the whole time investigating him, I think that the reason, there's this kind of tension between the economy doing well and his poll numbers in the tank really do reflect the fact that there's just something new every day. There's just, people are just so weary. I think there is just, people are getting tired of it. They hate the tweets. And he misspells them. He doesn't even proofread his tweets. Global whamming. I mean,
We're getting whammed by global
And I
climate
just
change.
think that is really one of the biggest things, and that people just want things to happen. And also, I think that the shutdown hurt him. He sat right there in the White House, in the Oval Office, and said, "I'll take responsibility for the shutdown." And Chuck Schumer was like, "Could you say that into my lapel mic?" And he did. And there were scenes every day on every news station, ABC, NBC, CBS, even Fox, was like, you got to worry less about the pundits and more about the people. And I just think that the fact that there were 1 million people who were not working, almost 1 million people. Plus, they said the bars in D.C. were dying because nobody was working, nobody was going out for a drink.
During the shutdown, yeah.
Yeah, and in other places, people weren't going to the diner before they went to work because they weren't getting a paycheck. So the collateral damage is just, and I think you saw that in the midterms in terms of those pockets that gave Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, I guess Michigan, and all that gave him the election. They did not give his people the pass to go back to Washington or to go to Washington at the midterms. So I think people are saying, well, we tried that.
I want to turn to Michael Laughlin here because what I think we're seeing on the Democratic side legislatively and even in terms of the kinds of candidates that were elected is not only just simply a blue wave, but it seems to me that there's a certain amount of progressive wave coming. We should note that, for instance, there are a number of presidential candidates on the Democratic side who've endorsed the single-payer proposition, or Medicare for all, I guess as they call it. We had, as a moment ago mentioned, the new Green Deal, as it were, that's been put forward as a kind of framework and goals, and maybe we could do it. We saw the AOC talk about how she was a democratic socialist, for example, and I know a few years back, there were, I think it was in Iowa, there was like 40% of Democrats thought of themselves as, well, socialism is such a bad thing. What do you make of this shifting going on in terms of progressive politics, progressive ideas? And because one thing I suppose we should note is that Trump himself took a direct shot at the idea of socialism, and then to try to obviously attach it to Venezuela as opposed to, say, Finland, right? What do you
That was actually I think there was a telling moment when you had the President of the United States saying, "Oh, we're never going to be." Well, who is? I mean, it's fascinating because it wasn't too long ago that there was such a thing as the L word, which meant that you couldn't even acknowledge that you're a liberal, let alone a socialist. So what this tells us, what I would suggest is here's where we see the connection between social movements and our politics, and the social movement of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and then the Occupy Wall Street phenomenon, which taps into the inequality, the question of growing income inequality and growing wealth inequality. And that these three movements, I think, can have essentially now, with a generational shift as well, because we're moving really slowly from the baby boomers to the next generation and the millennial generation, for whom the concept of socialism is not automatically linked to the Cold War and to the authoritarianism and the totalitarianism of Stalin. Yeah. And it's disconnected. It's really more connected with the possibilities of Finland and the possibilities of the European states that are either socialist or quasi-socialist, but also are democratic and freedom. So it expresses a connection to liberation and to freedom. And so that's a culmination, I think, that we're seeing within the Democratic Party. And there's a left wind blowing. Because I think all four the top tier candidates right now in the Democratic Party have signed on to these kinds of issues. The wealth tax with Warren, increasing marginal tax increase. That's been getting supporting this Green Deal is getting at least initial support as well, and I think that's going to be a very powerful part of the movement forward for the Democratic Party in the next election cycle.
So I'm going to turn to you because you are the conservative amongst other things, but I want to pose this in you.
No, I'm the realist.
Well, maybe not. We'll see.
Okay.
So there was not a civil rights movement. There was not a women's movement. There was not an economic inequality movement.
I'm ready to go.
Okay, so let me put it in political terms. So I do think it's true that the Gen Xers and particularly the millennials, they don't look at these words and these ideas
they have
as
entirely different meanings.
right,
I agree.
as opposed to say the boomers who certainly experienced the Cold War. So how do conservatives deal with this wind that seems to be blowing and saying, I mean, ask a millennial, well, you want health care for all? I say, well, sure, why not? Particularly in an uncertain economy.
No, my granddaughter would have
how
the
do you
same
do-
response.
Yeah.
She would have the same response.
Yeah, so
if I give you a car when you turn 16 for free, would that be, oh, I'd love that. Yeah, we all like free stuff. Nobody argues with free stuff. The issue is who's going to pay for the free stuff. In my granddaughter's case, I'm going to pay for it. Okay,
And she'll probably say that's right. Go ahead.
But the millennials, the snowflakes, have no idea who's going to pay for it, and that's the problem. We don't have the money, and when the dream team comes out and says, well, we don't have to worry about how much it's going to cost, we can print more money and deficit spending. We can't do that. That's going to be that kind of thinking that socialism brings of, even in Venezuela, that had untold riches in oil, is unable to meet the demands of socialism because of corruption and inability of enough money to be used to give everybody something for free.
They were hit by the drop in the oil prices, but go ahead.
Oil prices hurt them too, but they still have
really seriously.
and the sanctions that we put on them are only making it worse. But having said that, Venezuela, Cuba are the examples in our part of the world, our hemisphere, of where socialism has failed. And so that the millennials will eventually, I hope, see what's going on in Venezuela.
But those are third world countries. If you look at, for instance, so you look at, for instance, the Nordic countries, for example,
but they are
right, or
the
Germany.
point of them being democratic socialism. They still have the freedom to vote in and vote out people.
That's right,
and they have
so
a legal system that's fair and still follows the law.
So why should one assume that there's going to be an authoritarian shift in the United States if there are socialist programs?
Because if the socialist program says we're going to pay you even if you're unwilling to work, that is not going to succeed in the United States. That's what they said. That was in the. That was one of the tenets. We're going to get rid of cows. We're going to get rid of planes. We're going to get rid of. So
you see the conservative argument as say, well, these are all well and good, but it's going to cost too much. Is that going to be the conservative argument?
No. I think the conservative argument is we would love to see our economy be so dynamic that everybody has a good job, that everybody has health care because their employer is going to give it to them, that we want to make our economy strong, and that raises everybody's boat. Spending money that we don't have, I'm not sure that that's the answer.
Well, how do you explain the tax cut? I mean, that's accelerated the deficit. If that isn't spending money we don't have.
What was the deficit when Trump came on board was $25 trillion. What's the deficit now? 25.7? I don't know. No. The previous administration took our deficit and just made it unbelievably big.
This is, I think, is where the conservatives are always. They're pushed forward against their will, and they're always sort of drawing the next line. It's going to be this line I'll defend, and then of course they're pushed back because I think what's driving the millennials and the ex-geners, they're looking around. They're saying, well, let's see, Japan has a universal health care. France has universal health care. Germany has universal health care. Our northern partner, Canada, has universal health care. And they're doing just fine economically, and their freedom. There's not an authoritarian government in those countries, and they're not going broke. They're not going broke. So the idea that the richest country in the world in human history can't afford universal health care, they say, well, that seems simply false on its face. So, John, for you to say we can't afford it, well, we can afford it, but we're going to have to tax the people who have the money, right? So it's not a coincidence that the folks who oppose this are those folks who have money in the Republican Party. Those are the folks, they're the ones who say we can't afford it because they don't want to cough up the money that they've got.
My hard-earned money, you want me to give away. Okay, hold on. No.
The other countries, how about those? They have rich people in those countries too, right? Canada and Japan and Germany and so on. But they've come to a conclusion that they can belly up to the bar here and pay their fair share for a common good. A common good.
And so who's not getting care in the United States? Who's not getting care in the United States?
There are plenty of people who are getting less care than they should.
Less care than they should. Okay. So when you
you go to the emergency room, there's a law that says you got to be taken care of.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because of the fact that, and you're a physician, John, you see this
all the time.
More than I do, but the cost of health care is skyrocketing because if you've got a child with a fever of 104 and you don't have health care, you're going to go to the ER. And what is the cost for a Tylenol in the ER as opposed...
You can't go to the ER for less than $1,000, I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
My husband just had surgery. $30,000. And I mean, the reality is our health care is so expensive because it is so inefficiently administered. And I would take exception to some extent about the idea that the millennials want everything for free. I think they just want to be able to afford it. They just want to be able to not have to make a choice between health care and paying their mortgage. I mean, or their rent, whatever that is. I think that there's a way to do this. Michael talks about this. I mean, you know, everybody was all up in arms when now Senator Romney was running against President Obama, and it came out that so much of his income was from, I guess, investment dividends, and it was taxed at a lower rate. And you know, I think that it involves some hard choices, but they've got to be made, or you know, the pendulum swings here, it swings there, and we always do better when it kind of is swinging in a...
But isn't the answer to the millennium problem that they come out and get a job? Isn't that...
I think there are a lot of working millennials who still can't afford health care.
Really?
Well, if it's minimum wage, by the way.
Yeah.
But we need to move on here.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to talk about briefly. We'll talk about immigration because the president spent a great deal of time about immigration, and yet we know that undocumented immigration is at its lowest in something like a decade or so. As a matter of fact, there's in terms of crime, for example. They're like 47% less to say being jailed than say somebody who's native born. So let me start with you, Mike, and go to John. What do you make of that? I mean, you spent a great deal of time with a lot of examples of crime and so on and so forth, and claims about them flooding across, and yet that doesn't seem to be the case. What do you make of that?
This is the dimension of the speech that I thought revealed a kind of this xenophobic. I call it xenophobic nationalism, which has been a key piece, clearly of the campaign that got him elected. It is the big lie, essentially, and it's the propaganda piece of who Trump is and his campaign. So he is making, of course, more of the problem than it is. No one denies that we don't have an immigration problem in the sense that we have undocumented workers within the United States for many years, and people who do come in, that the whole problem of how to adjudicate their legal status and like those. So immigration reform has been on the agenda for a long time. But for Trump, he has essentially manufactured this as if this is a major crisis, a major threat to our national security, which it is clearly not. But he's riding this horse, and he thinks he can ride this horse into the next election cycle, I think, which raises the question of whether there will be any interim resolution with regard to whether or not Trump will agree to some kind of a deal that the Democrats and Republicans are trying to work through in Congress, and even if it doesn't involve his his wall, his barrier wall, because and so that still looms now. Whether there's no indication, clearly an indication whether he will agree to essentially agree with for a bill that doesn't include the wall, or whether he'll deny that and close down the government again, or take the route of declaring a national emergency. But I think that's clearly still an option that he may in fact take, which would generate another dynamic, of course, because that law says, well, the Congress could then vote to overturn the president's judgment on that, but then the president could veto that, which would then require a 2/3 vote to overturn that, and then a legal challenge as well as a possibility with regard to that. So we're seeing various scenarios that could play out in the very near-term future, all of which have consequences for the next electoral cycle. None of them, perhaps, genuinely resolving the problem of the border. Right?
I want to get to you and this idea that, I mean, the wall's not particularly popular in these sort of polls.
Except he ran on it.
But
the poll's not popular, except he ran on it.
But I think but even moving away from the wall, how effective do you think this immigration theme is going to be as he moves into the next election? Because it doesn't. Even immigration doesn't really top the concern.
No. Immigration is a concern for many people, but mostly people
within the base.
The base is concerned about it, but I mean, it's a border issue in terms of people coming across. That's an issue. It's not just immigration; it's drugs. It's not just keeping illegal aliens out. It's keeping drugs out, maintaining a solid border, because we know that's where the drugs are coming across. And people are dying from that. Illegal immigrants are killing people in the United States. That's understood. And he believes that a wall is only part of it. He's really talking about border security. And I think there is support across the United States for that. In fact, some of the polls have shown there's Hispanic support. More than the majority of Hispanics in the United States who are citizens are in favor of further security in the southern border. So this is not, I don't know that's as much of a racial divide as has been described, because if that's true, then Hispanics wouldn't be supporting it. Having said all that, the issue is that immigration decline started during the Obama administration, and he in fact had the deportations started at that point in time, and that's when immigration started to fall, those numbers. And then there was a change, and the numbers of illegal immigrants started to climb again. And I think Trump ran on that. It's an important issue for him, and I don't think he's going to give up. Will he do an executive order? I don't think he's going to do that. I think he's going to try and work within the system to get some deal this weekend from Republicans and Democrats. I think he'll get a deal. I think there'll be a lot of pressure on him to do it. In terms of will he get another shutdown? No, I don't think so. Although the shutdown towards the end, there were Democrats, including Steny Hoyer, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party. He was saying, we got to do something to stop this, and if we got to do some kind of a deal, let's do it. So I think there is a sense on the part of the Democratic Party that some kind of a deal has to be struck with Trump, because they just can't have this catastrophe happen again, because it hurt a lot of people. And Trump has weathered it reasonably well. The base goes, again, I'm speaking as a member of the base, going, yeah, he had to shut it down. That's the only way he could get them to talk.
Well, first of all, immigration is the lowest it's been, I think, since 1971. So I think that counters the idea that this is a crisis. And I think I had a political science professor in college who used to say, the basic problem with complex issues is that on the surface, they seem simple. And I think that's the way the president is trying to portray this. If we string a big wall down there on the southern border, that'll take care of it. Well, immigration reform is in the 21st century is going to be so much more effective with a multi-pronged, complex approach. No question. And I think that the idea that we're going to pass a wall, we're going to fund this $5 billion, it's going to build us some wall. We don't own the land down there, and Texans aren't famous for wanting to give up their land. It has the potential, I've actually heard this, to be an environmental disaster to have a wall on the Rio Grande. it's just he had the deal. He had a good deal back in December, and he when Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity called him to task, he doubled down, and I think that is what people are aware of and what people are just getting tired of. And if the wall was such a great idea, he's been in office for 2 years with a Republican majority. Why don't we have people down there just slathering bricks together and building us a wall?
There is a money appropriation issue, but
Yeah,
that's,
well, I
Not
mean,
that
exactly,
much.
but
Right,
but obviously, and we just had a big appearance in Congress by the intelligence community talking about the threats to the United States security, national security last week, and not a one of them mentioned the wall, the southern border. And you talk about the drugs coming in. It's documented that 90% of the drugs come in through legal ports of entry. So let's look at this thing holistically and in a comprehensive way. I don't think that anybody, the president is trying to portray this as you're either for just opening the borders and letting every Tom, Dick, and Harry come in, or you're with me on my wall. And I think that there are a lot of people who believe that the immigration system needs to be reformed and believes that we need to have a well-defined, well-understood system. But the wall is not the answer.
I need to turn to the state of Virginia.
Oh, good. Here we go.
So the state of Virginia, just to recap, Governor Ralph Northam is now under pressure to resign after a photo of a man in blackface and another dressed in a KKK robes appeared in his medical school yearbook. His name, by the way, is at the top of that page. He first apologized and denied that he was in the photo, but he admitted wearing shoe polish at a dance as part of a Michael Jackson thing that he did. This is all in the 1980s. Then Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, he's accused by Vanessa Tyson of forcing her into oral sex. He has denied that, saying it was consensual. And then we have Attorney General Mark Herring. He admits to wearing shoe polish when imitating a rapper at a party. But Republicans also have another issue, which is Tommy Normant. He's the majority leader in the state Senate there. Apparently he was once the managing editor of a yearbook that was filled with racial slurs and blackface images. To be fair, he responded to the story confirming he was in the position of managing the yearbook, but he also said that there were 7 students total who worked on the yearbook, and he, of course, condemned the blackface as abhorrent. I think I've got it all there. So, I'll start with you, Barry. So what do we make of this? We have a racial component, which is obviously the blackface, but then we also have these sexual accusations against the lieutenant governor. What do you
I
make
think
of this?
they're all very serious, and I think that Virginia has kind of a tortured history with this whole issue. And I mean, the first slaves in this country came in through Virginia, and it's just something that. I believe that to just kind of ignore either of them, but especially the racial issues, to ignore them and not have consequences, and it just sets the whole thing back. I think that Governor Northam should resign. Lieutenant Governor Fairfax, I just that's a tough one, because I was not in favor of Brett Kavanaugh because I thought that there was too much.
Right, he was accused.
And too much smoke there not to be some fire. I'm not sure, but what I find interesting is that all of these things that the Republicans in Congress or in the Senate now are coming out and condemning Senator or Governor Northam, and I think he needs to step down. He cannot be effective. The whole issue of racial justice cannot be advanced until that happens.
What about the idea that if you had all three resign, a Republican would become governor?
Yeah, who won by a
enough?
toss of the coin, or
That's
the
right.
name being.
He pulled their name. I mean, so that's, in other words, it would be from politics standpoint. What about that?
Yeah, I think that I think that's a conundrum.
Be
I don't have the answer to that, but I also think that we don't advance as a society if we don't take a stand at some point. I mean, you might say, well, that was 35 years ago. Well, he was 25. He was in medical school. I mean, the man is. My mother used to say, you ought to know better, and it was wrong. And I don't know what happened in that Boston room in the convention, in the Democratic
Right.
Convention in 2004. But you know, I mean, we have a very credible woman standing up there saying, "I did not want to do this," and so I think that you know, the whole thing is just. It's a mess, as my mother would say, and I don't see any way out of it except for those people to step down.
John, I want to ask you about the politics of it. Although people have obviously accused the president of being less than
Forthright or less than
forthright, and,
yes.
and we had a lot of women who obviously accused him.
And that was known before they
used race
voted
and so
for him.
on.
And it was known before they voted for him.
That's true,
Yes.
but nonetheless,
Okay.
one could take a position
I-
and say no, he shouldn't have been president because of that.
Yeah.
But that's but from a politics point of view, do you think this is going to influence the upcoming elections? Because we've got state elections coming up, and they can't. It's
we
not
can't
like Northam
lose.
can go
This
out.
is a no. We can't lose
ahead.
on this one, no matter what happens. It's not a conundrum. It's hypocrisy. If they stay in, it's good for Republicans when the election takes place later this year. If they are gone, then theoretically a Republican will be the governor. And when his name got picked up, he may have said, "Oh, rats," rather than "hooray." Having said that, from my point of view as a Republican, we cannot lose, because if they stay in, they're clearly inappropriate for them to be there. But if the Democrats don't want them to leave, or they don't leave, then that's hypocrisy. If they do leave, then theoretically could be a Republican. But either way, come November, it's going to help the Republican Party, and I don't see how it's going to hurt us. And I think the other issue that started this, in some respects, was the abortion issue. Now, I don't know whether you want to talk about that or not, but that may have been what got this whole deal started. Was the governor's
I think
statement
there's a
in that
report
regard.
to some extent to that. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and so that may have been the ball that started this whole process. And I don't know where it's going to end, because as you've stated appropriately, it's going down the ladder to the Attorney General. Now there's a senior Republican senator who's been accused,
Right.
and we don't know how many other pictures of blackface will turn up
Right.
in the political leadership of Virginia. But it's not good for anybody. But from my point of view, as looking at it as a Republican on the outside, this is a win-win for us, and it looks good for us come September in Virginia. And in terms of the other issues that have been raised, in terms of the hypocrisy issue, I think that's going to be good for us come 2020.
I think that it has the potential to have some real backlash against the president, because at some point people are going to, if indeed the governor leaves, or even if he stays, he's going to be ineffective, and it's people are going to connect the dots. Some people are going to connect the dots that the president has been accused by women of sexual assault. Oh, I'm sorry, the president admitted to sexual assault. That's what happened. That too. And he's also shown himself to be a racist. So I think that at some point, if people start connecting those dots, if it's wrong for the governor of Virginia to do it, maybe it's wrong for the president of the United
I know
States.
John objects to that, but I gotta ask him a question here. I mean, I do have to, because I know you do not believe that to be the case. The issue of blackface in Virginia, what's going on? Is this a Southern thing? I mean, I don't know.
I don't know the full history of that, so I wouldn't claim to have that kind of knowledge. But I do think it does reflect, nonetheless, a part of the deep-seated racist history of the South, and certainly within Virginia, and I put it in the context of, again, what we're seeing here from a social movement dynamic again, is the ongoing power of the civil rights movement, manifested with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, and of course the women's movement, and now manifested in the Me Too movement. And that this is bringing to a boiling point, essentially, a sensitivity now within the Democratic Party, to its credit, I would say, unlike the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is now having to deal with this and trying to actually make a judgment about what is the moral and the just way to move forward. and the political pressure, of course, as well, is as Barry just mentioned, that the governor, Northam, who is a Democrat, just elected, was on the leading edge of the Democratic Party, has no more credibility because of this issue, because of this, which means the power of the black constituency and the African American consciousness now saying we demand more. We demand more from our political leaders, that they actually do look upon us as equal citizens to white people. And in the case of Fairfax, I mean, again, can he lead with authority in the light of this allegation? It really depends upon the credibility of her allegation, which at first glance looks quite credible. And so once again, the judgments, and I think this is longer term, this is more positive for the Democrats. I mean, John may be right. In the near term, the Republicans may benefit, but in the longer term, the Democrats, they say, we want to be the party that does not tolerate sexual assault, does not tolerate racism within our party. The party is going to be better off for it. And I think the country is better off for it as
Real
well.
quick, you want to say something, because I have everything I want to ask about.
Okay, just quickly.
Real quick.
Racism is always thrown at Republicans. And now all of a sudden we have a couple of Democrats, okay, in party leadership in a southern state who have portrayed racial animus. And to have the Democrats not immediately tar and feather these guys is, I just can't believe it. It's got to help us. The black population of the United States has to look at this and say, maybe the Republicans aren't the only ones, and maybe I should vote for somebody who's going to help me get a job, help me get better wages.
Okay.
I want to think. I just wanted to say something that I don't know how relevant this is, or actually how accurate it is. But
We don't have to be accurate.
my memory of the term Jim Crow comes from the 1830s or something, where it was a minstrel show, and I think it was a white who would be in blackface. So it has about the worst connotation that you know.
By the way, I just want to wrap up. We lost a friend of the show, Mike Prettle. He had a heart attack on Christmas Day. But John, you and he sparred a great deal. What are your final thoughts about him?
You don't know how much I miss Mike. I mean, because he was always honest. I always knew what he was going to say, because he was very principled and stood behind his thoughts, and always was. He never wavered, and that's so appealing to see somebody who feels so strongly about something that they never waver. And that's what I remember about Mike. He and I didn't always agree, but I knew he was not going to turn away from the things that he believed to be principled and true and best for his thoughts for America. That's what I remember from Mike.
Barry, what about you?
Well, we chatted about this when I was on a few weeks ago. I think that whether you agreed or you disagreed with Mike, you always admired the fact that he had his facts straight, he knew what he believed, he could back it up, and that he cared passionately about the issue and not just the argument or being right or being elected. That behind his advocacy was always a passion for better.
Anyway, I might add, by the way, John, I did speak at his memorial, and one of the last things I said was I could still hear his voice in my head turning to you and saying, John, that's just not true.
That's ingrained in my memories as well.
Well, we've been speaking with John Barkovich. He's a Wycomico County Republican. Barry Tillman, former mayor of Salisbury. And also we have Salisbury University political science professor Michael Laughlin. And no doubt we'll all do this again.
Sooner the better.
That's right.
Thanks, Don.
Thank
no
you.
problem. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Ranck. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.